All right. It looks like everybody waiting at the door has now been able to enter our virtual lecture hall. So I think we're going to get started. Good evening, and welcome to the 16th annual David and Marilyn Knutson Lecture. My name is Agnes Choi, and I'm the chair of PLU's Department of Religion. In just a moment, I'll introduce this evening's speaker, but first, it is right that we begin with this acknowledgement. In alignment with PLU's mission statement and values of thoughtful inquiry, service, leadership, and care, it is important for those of us who call this place home and aspire to disrupt and dismantle oppression to honor and send gratitude to the first inhabitants of this land who continue to be leaders for justice in our community today. A first step is this land acknowledgement. Although we may be zooming in from many locations, we acknowledge that the PLU campus is on the traditional territory of the Nisqually, Puyallup, Squaxin Island, and Steilacoom people, who prior to the Medicine Creek Treaty of 1854, which removed Native people to clear way for colonial settlement, lived on and cared for this land and watershed, now known as Chambers Creek, as their ancestral home. We acknowledge that this oppression is not just a relic of the past, but is an ongoing injustice. On behalf of the entire religion department, I am delighted to welcome all of you virtually to the David and Marilyn Knutson Lecture. My particular welcomes are extended to our speaker this evening, the Reverend Dr. James Martin-Schramm. As an annual event organized by the religion department, As an annual event organized by the Religion Department, this lectureship stems from the generosity and intellectual passions of David and Marilyn Knutson to share the best thinking in the field of religion with our PLU family and wider community. I would like to extend a special thank you to Marilyn for her hard work and generosity in making this lecture possible. I would also like to thank all the people who have worked hard to bring us this event tonight, particularly Kendall Jeske, the Director of Congregational Engagement, Mary Duval in the Office of Advancement, and Tracy Williamson in the Division of Humanities. In the Religion Department, thanks are due to Professor Eric Hammerstrom, who has worked hard in organizing this lecture. I would also like to thank in advance Professors Eric Hammerstrom and Seth Dowland, who will be the moderators for the Q&A session tonight. Following this evening's lecture, our speaker will take some questions from the audience, so I encourage you to listen closely and to write down questions that emerge for you. You may use the Q&A channel that you see at the bottom of the screen to submit your questions at any time for our speaker to consider after his talk, and our moderators will make sure to pass the questions along. Within the Religion Department, I have the privilege of teaching courses on the Bible, and so I would like to share a quotation from the Jewish Bible found in the book of Proverbs, chapter 4, verse 7. One's translation of this passage in the New Revised Standard Version reads as follows: "The beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom, and whatever else you get insight." Another translation, in the New International Version, translates the original Hebrew slightly differently. "Wisdom is supreme, therefore get wisdom. Though it cost all you have, get understanding." When the book of Proverbs says wisdom, what it actually means is education. And when the book of Proverbs says insight and understanding, what it actually means is purposeful or thoughtful education. So PLU's mission statement about thoughtful inquiry is more than providential. Lutes don't just receive an education, they receive a thoughtful and purposeful education, as the book of Proverbs recommends. In our modern capitalist society, many are motivated not to get wisdom, but to get money. And in the age of social media, others are driven not to get wisdom, but to get fame. And if one is interested in finding information, that can be found on the World Wide Web's information highway. But information is not the same as a thoughtful education. The book of Proverbs does not encourage the pursuit of money, fame, or mere information. Rather, we are to seek wisdom, insight, and understanding. In order to address the realities of climate change that the world faces today, surely we need all the wisdom, insight, and understanding that we can get. The realities of climate change are no secret. Even if one hasn't personally measured the melting of polar ice caps or the rising sea levels, and even if one hasn't calculated the rates of deforestation or assessed the impact on land and water resources, I'm confident that you've noticed on the news the increasing number of reports of extreme weather patterns. And if you were in the Pacific Northwest this past summer, you could not have failed to notice the heat dome that we experienced. But how does one acquire wisdom on an issue as complicated as climate change? And where does one find insight and understanding? One way to gain wisdom, insight, and understanding is through the experiences and learning of others. This evening, we have the opportunity to learn from Martin Luther, from whom PLU gets our middle name, Pacific Lutheran University. And we have the opportunity to learn from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a German Lutheran pastor and an anti-Nazi dissident in the Second World War. We also have the opportunity to learn from the Reverend Dr. Jim Martin-Schramm. Jim is Professor Emeritus of Religion at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, and he is an ordained member of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. He holds a Master of Divinity from Luther Northwestern Theological Seminary and a PhD in Christian Ethics from Union Theological Seminary. Most of Jim's scholarship has been in the area of ethics and public policy, and he is the author or co-editor of such publications as Climate Justice, Ethics, Energy, and Climate Policy, published by Fortress Press. Earth Ethics, a Case Method Approach, published by Orbis Books. And Eco-Reformation, Grace and Hope for a Planet in Peril, published by Wipfenstock. Don't be deceived, however. Jim's scholarship is not confined to the ivory tower of academia. Quite the contrary. Jim has served on the boards of the Iowa Wind Energy Association and Iowa Interfaith Power and Light. He currently serves on the board of the Winneshiek Energy District and is a director of Luther College Wind Energy Project. Jim has helped to develop Luther's renewable energy projects and recently ended a term as the director of Luther's Center for Sustainable Communities. And if that wasn't enough, he currently serves as chair of the City of Decorah Sustainability Commission. Before Jim earned his master's and doctoral degrees, he earned a Bachelor of Arts degree, and he earned it right here at PLU. So I'm particularly glad to welcome Jim this evening, not only to our virtual podium, but also to his academic home. Welcome, and welcome home, Jim.
Thank you very much, Agnes. That's a wonderful introduction. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you this evening. As a PLU alum, it's such an honor and a privilege to be invited to give this 16th annual David and Marilyn Knutson lecture. I only wish we could all be together in person. Yesterday, I had a lovely conversation with Marilyn Knutson via Zoom. We discovered that we are both born in Moline, Illinois. We both attended PLU without previously visiting campus, and we both met the love of our lives at PLU. I deeply regret that given my course schedule and David Knutson's health issues, that I wasn't able to take a course with him during my time there. My wife, Karen, however, got to know David very well as a student in his courses and also as a student worker. She read books to him when he could no longer do so himself and helped him with various research tasks. David was such a kind and brilliant man, and Marilyn was ever so gracious during our conversation together. Their love for each other reminds me of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's wishes when he became engaged to his fiancée, Maria von Wiedemeyer. Dietrich said in a letter to Maria, "Let our marriage be a yes to God's earth." David and Marilyn have certainly been such a blessing to others. I first encountered the life and thought of Dietrich Bonhoeffer when I was a student at PLU. In fact, David Knutson was scheduled to teach our course in the spring of 1979, but he had to bow out when health issues flared up. So David arranged for a Catholic scholar, Charles A. McConis, to teach the course. 2 years earlier, Charles had completed his dissertation at Columbia University. It was titled Religion and Radicalism: The American Catholic Left as a Social Movement from 1961 to 1975. While he was teaching our course, Charlie, as he wanted to be called, was deeply engaged in protests against the sighting of Trident nuclear submarines at the US Navy port in Bangor, Washington. Thus, from the very start, my understanding of Bonhoeffer was tied to political advocacy and activism. So I'm going to share my screen now so that I can use some slides throughout the rest of my presentation. So just hang in there for a sec. I have chosen intentionally in the title of my lecture to mirror Dietrich Bonhoeffer's provocative essay on the Church and the Jewish Question, which was published in July of 1933. The essay grew out of a controversial talk Bonhoeffer delivered in April of 1933 to a group of pastors as the Nazi regime dictated a series of new laws that dispossessed many of their rights, especially those deemed to be Jews. Bonhoeffer drew on Luther's doctrine of the two kingdoms as he addressed what he and others called the Jewish question. I want to draw upon the same two kingdoms tradition and Bonhoeffer's threefold guidance in his essay to reflect on the climate question, which I believe is the most pressing issue we face today. Before I begin, however, I need to say a bit more about the doctrine of the two kingdoms. Luther was not a modern person. While he was a key hinge between the medieval and the modern eras, Luther had an apocalyptic worldview that tends to be off-putting to those of us schooled by the Enlightenment. When Luther looked out his window, he saw God at war with Satan. Luther believed that God fought Satan in two ways: as the creator of the world and as the redeemer of the world. Luther believed God as creator established the institution of government in God's kingdom of temporal authority to enforce laws that would preserve a modicum of peace with justice in the world. It was precisely because human beings remain subject to the forces of sin, death, and the devil, to use Luther's phrase, that their sinfulness needed to be restrained by the coercive power of government's sword. At the same time, Luther believed God as the redeemer of the world, established the institution of the church in the kingdom of spiritual authority to use the word of God to preach the gospel of love and mercy. In a world subject to the powers of evil, Luther believed God protected human beings through both the work of government and the church. God was at work in both, but Luther believed it was vital to distinguish between the two and not to collapse the one into the other. The church should not subsume the state, and the state should not meddle in the affairs of the church. Dietrich Bonhoeffer brought Luther's two kingdoms doctrine to bear on the rapidly rising anti-Semitism in Germany after Hitler became chancellor on January 30th, 1933. When the German parliament building, the Reichstag, was destroyed by fire on February 27th, Hitler issued an emergency decree titled "For the Protection of People and State," which abolished virtually all constitutional rights. On March 22nd, the first concentration camp was opened in Dachau to incarcerate those who protested the loss of their civil rights and others who were viewed as threats to the Nazi regime. On April 7th, Hitler announced the law for the reconstitution of the civil service, which precluded any non-Aryans from functioning as civil servants. Because university professors and Protestant pastors were regarded as civil servants, this law had a direct impact on Bonhoeffer's brother-in-law, a professor of constitutional law, and Bonhoeffer's best friend, who wanted to become an ordained Protestant pastor. Both were baptized Christians with one or more Jewish parents or grandparents, which rendered them non-Aryans under this new Nazi law. Bonhoeffer's talk and subsequent essay, The Church and the Jewish Question, was divided into two parts. By the way, on the image here, Bonhoeffer didn't even make the front page of the journal. He's buried down here in the second article inside. Anyway, his essay was divided into two parts. The first part focused on how and whether the church can judge the actions of the state. The second part focused on how the church should regard the status of baptized Jews in the church. My talk tonight focuses just on the first part of Bonhoeffer's comments regarding the relation of the church to the state. Bonhoeffer identified two concerns regarding the state's responsibility for promoting law and order, and he identified three possible responses to these concerns. Bonhoeffer began by emphasizing that the church, in his words, has to affirm the state as God's order of preservation. Bonhoeffer chose his words carefully here. He refused to refer to government as one of God's orders of creation, because many conservative Lutheran theologians had used such rhetoric to promote uncritical obedience to the current governing authorities that had presumably been instituted by God, according to Romans 13, verse 1. Bonhoeffer emphasized that governments exist to preserve what God has made and to protect them from evil forces that still abound, and nevertheless, they are still accountable to God for that task. This doesn't mean, however, that the church is indifferent about the actions of the state. So in the essay, Bonhoeffer writes, instead, the church can and must keep asking the government whether its actions can be justified as legitimate state actions. That is, actions that create law and order, not the lack of rights and disorder. In doing so, the church will, of course, see the state limited in two ways: either too little law and order or too much law and order compels the church to speak. Bonhoeffer was very clear about what constituted too little law and order. He said, it occurs whenever a group of people is deprived of its rights. Any state that deprives people of their legal rights is acting in a lawless manner and thus loses its legitimacy and divinely appointed authority. Bonhoeffer was referring here to all whose constitutional rights had been vitiated by Hitler's emergency decree, including the Jews. Bonhoeffer was also clear about what constituted too much law and order. This occurs when the state interferes in the affairs of the church and uses its force, quote, to rob the Christian faith of its right to proclaim its message, end quote. Here, Bonhoeffer was referring to baptized Jews who had been singled out for discrimination in the law for the reconstitution of the civil service, and to rising cries among German Christian Nazi sympathizers that demanded Jewish Christians be excluded from Protestant congregations. As noted earlier, the law prevented baptized Jews from ever serving as Protestant pastors, since pastors were civil servants. The German Christians wanted to extend this discrimination further to affect all lay people who were baptized Jews or had Jewish heritage. Bonhoeffer drew a bold line in the sand and emphasized that such unlawful and unchristian acts of discrimination not only violated the integrity of the Christian gospel, but also violated the obligations of the state to preserve legitimate law and order. Bonhoeffer argued that the church had three actions it could take in situations like these in which the state was preserving too little law and order in society or was wielding too much law and order by interfering in the affairs of the church. Each action was radical in its own way for Bonhoeffer's principally Lutheran audience and community of accountability. The first action was for the church to question the state. Bonhoeffer says, question the state as to the legitimate state character of its actions. That is, making the state responsible for what it does, end quote. This confrontation of the state by the church was largely inconceivable among Lutherans in Bonhoeffer's day because most had radically and incorrectly separated Luther's doctrine of the two kingdoms and thus were honoring Hitler with naive, uncritical obedience. Regardless whether the state responded to the church's questions and changed its behavior, Bonhoeffer argued the second action the church should take was to, quote, engage in service to the victims of the state's actions because the church has an unconditional obligation to the victims of any societal order, even if they do not belong to the Christian community, end quote. Here, Bonhoeffer was making it clear that Christians needed to come to the aid of Jews and all others who had become the victims of the Nazi state. He was not confining his concern to Jewish Christian victims of Nazi discrimination, and thus he was not allowing Christian communities to be concerned only about themselves. Bonhoeffer argued that the followers of Jesus have an obligation to all who suffer, whether they confess Christ's name or not. Bonhoeffer saved his most radical contention for last. He wrote, quote, the third possibility is not just to bind up the wounds of the victims beneath the wheel, but to seize the wheel itself. Such an action would be direct political action on the part of the church, end quote. At this point, some of the pastors in April of 1933 left the room. What Bonhoeffer was proposing was scandalous to their ears. Not only did it violate their false understanding about the separation of church and state, what Bonhoeffer was proposing was potentially treasonous, the penalty for which was death. To take Bonhoeffer's counsel seriously would be to risk one's life, which is precisely what Bonhoeffer did. I think Bonhoeffer's views on the church and the Jewish question offer a template with which to think about the church's response to global warming and climate change. Almost 10 years before the final solution was adopted at the Wannsee conference in January of 1942, I doubt most of the pastors who attended Bonhoeffer's talk in April of 1933 thought that the Jewish question was the most important issue facing their nation. They probably were more concerned about Germany's poor economy, high unemployment, and diminished stature in global politics. This is certainly true in the United States today. According to the most recent poll about national priorities conducted by the Pew Research Center earlier this year, 8 in 10 Americans say strengthening the nation's economy and dealing with the coronavirus pandemic should be top priorities for the president and Congress. Those who were polled collectively placed dealing with climate change well down the list. It ranked only 15th out of 19 policy issues. Reality, however, does not match public perception. According to a recent study published in the journal Nature Climate Change, 85% of the global population has experienced weather events made worse by climate change. Germany, Belgium, and China all experienced record flooding this year, and Siberia had temperatures over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. In the United States, as of October 8th, 2021, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reports that there have been 18 weather/climate disaster events with losses exceeding $1 billion in the United States this year. Overall, these droughts, floods, severe storms, hurricanes, and wildfires have killed 538 people and have caused significant economic harm. Recently, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued its 6th assessment report. I want to lift up just 2 of the headlines from their summary for policymakers. First, they write, "It is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. Widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere have occurred." Second, they say, global surface temperature will continue to increase until at least the mid-century under all emissions scenarios considered. Global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius will be exceeded during the 21st century unless deep reductions in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions occur in the coming decades. The world has already warmed about 1.1 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the 19th century. As in previous reports, the 6th assessment report considers the likelihood and extent of further additional warming through different scenarios. Unfortunately, Earth's average surface temperature is projected to hit or exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels around 2030 in all 5 of the greenhouse gas emissions scenarios. Alarmingly, this is 3 decades sooner than was envisioned just a few years ago in the 5th assessment report. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has described the 6th assessment report as, quote, "a code red for humanity," end quote. He sounded the alarm in the following way at a press conference. "We must act decisively now to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius alive. We are already at 1.2 degrees Celsius and rising. Warming has accelerated in recent decades. Every fraction of a degree counts. Greenhouse gas concentrations are at record levels. Extreme weather and climate disasters are increasing in frequency and intensity. That is why this year's United Nations Climate Conference in Glasgow is so important." It is for these reasons that I think the climate question is the most important issue facing us today. A famous report by the United Nations Development Program published over a decade ago summarized the situation this way. Climate change demands urgent action now to address a threat to 2 constituencies with little or no political voice: the world's poor and future generations. It raises profoundly important questions about social justice, equity, and human rights across countries and generations. Dangerous climate change is the avoidable catastrophe of the 21st century and beyond. Future generations will pass a harsh judgment on a generation that looked at the evidence on climate change, understood the consequences, and then continued on a path that consigned millions of the world's most vulnerable people to poverty and exposed future generations to the risk of ecological disaster. I am convinced Dietrich Bonhoeffer would agree that climate change poses great threats to social justice and human rights for present and future generations. In his famous essay, After 10 Years, Bonhoeffer writes, quote, "The ultimate question for a responsible person to ask is how the coming generation is to live. It is only from this question, with the responsibility towards history, that fruitful solutions will come." Bonhoeffer thought the church should confront the state when its actions resulted in too little or too much law and order. The facts are that the US Senate refused to ratify the Kyoto Protocol all the way back in 1997, and more than 2 decades later, Congress has still not passed legislation that will help reduce our nation's emissions fast enough to forestall catastrophic climate change. In addition, US greenhouse gas emissions per person remain higher than almost every other industrialized nation in the world. Only Saudi Arabia, Australia, and Canada have higher per capita emissions. All of these facts reflect a situation of too little law and order. So, has the church confronted the state? In fact, the ELCA and many of its ecumenical partners have been quite assertive through their public policy advocacy ministries with respect to global warming and climate change for over 2 decades. Most recently, the ELCA has participated in the America is All In campaign, which is an expansive coalition of thousands of US cities, states, tribal nations, businesses, schools, and faith, health, and cultural institutions trying to help the federal government develop a national climate strategy that meets the urgency of the climate crisis. The coalition wants to cut US emissions in half by 2030 and to reach net zero emissions by 2050, while also guarding against the impacts of climate disruption. Clearly, however, there is a lot of work to do. Historically, the United States is by far the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, but other industrialized nations like Germany and the United Kingdom have legally binding emission targets, and they have reduced emissions far more rapidly than we have. Our nation is falling short. But how about the ELCA itself, which is my own community of accountability? It's easy to talk the talk, but it's harder to walk the talk. To what extent are the various expressions of the ELCA attempting to reduce their own greenhouse gas emissions? Are ELCA churches, synods, social service agencies, or the church-wide organization trying to measure their emissions and cut them in half by 2030? While there is no substitute for the force of law and the need for structural and systemic change, there is a place for moral witness, social responsibility, and perhaps even strategic, direct political action. I'm pleased that some of the 24 ELCA colleges and universities are concerned about global warming and climate change. For several years, I coordinated a page on the Lutherans Restoring Creation website that provides links to things ELCA colleges and universities are doing all over the nation. I am proud to be an alum of Pacific Lutheran University, whose president several years ago, Lauren Anderson, was one of the 12 original charter signatories of the American College and University President's Climate Commitment. I'm proud that Luther College is one of 7 ELCA schools that have signed on to that commitment, and I'm proud that Luther's Board of Regents recently reaffirmed a climate action plan that challenges the college to become carbon neutral by the year 2030. To date, Luther College has reduced its emissions 63% through major investments in energy efficiency, as well as wind and solar power. It's also encouraging that at least 20 of the ELCA's 65 synods have passed 47 different resolutions since 1999 about climate change and related issues like hydraulic fracturing, fossil fuel divestment, energy stewardship, care for creation, and eco-reformation. At the end of the day, however, less than 1/3 of the ELCA synods have taken such steps. It's harder to know what is happening locally within nearly 9,000 ELCA congregations. I know of some congregations that have made major investments in energy efficiency as well as solar, and others that have hosted workshops to help members reduce emissions produced by their households and daily activities. In my opinion, lay and ordained leadership regarding climate change is critical within our synods and congregations. I am so impressed by the courageous leadership of Reverend Jonathan Barker, who is an ELCA pastor in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Inspired by the courageous witness of some young men and women in the Sunrise Movement, he recently initiated a lengthy hunger strike to draw attention to the climate-related measures in the large infrastructure bill before Congress. I am also heartened by the faithful social witness of many members of the ELCA who advocate for aggressive climate policies like carbon pricing through their participation in groups like Lutherans Restoring Creation and Citizens Climate Lobby. Clearly, there are some good examples of personal responsibility and public witness by leaders in the ELCA, but it could be more widespread. For example, a few years ago, I invited all 3 ELCA bishops in Iowa to sign on to a relatively innocuous statement by faith leaders about climate change that was drafted by Iowa Interfaith Power and Light. 2 of the bishops quickly agreed to sign, but the 3rd declined, saying he wouldn't do anything that might cause more congregations to leave his synod. I reminded the bishop that the ELCA's vision and expectations policy, which was in force at that time, expected ordained leaders to, quote, speak on behalf of this earth, its environment and natural resources, and its inhabitants. This made no impact on the bishop. In my view, we would certainly have a different church if our presiding bishop disciplined pastors and bishops for failing to live up to the ELCA's expectations regarding peacemaking, justice, and stewardship of earth. Unfortunately, none of these expectations are found in the ELCA's new definitions and guidelines for discipline, nor are they in the vows in the ELCA rite for ordination. I think there is no question Bonhoeffer would urge the church in the United States to compel the state to live up to its obligations to protect present and future generations from the perils of climate change. He would condemn this lack of law and order in the face of climate change. However, as I've argued, I think Bonhoeffer might supplement his counsel by asking the church whether it's living up to its obligations. If the work of the state is to preserve law and order, the work of the church is to preach the gospel of love and mercy. Drawing upon his critique of cheap grace, Bonhoeffer might claim that the church's reluctance to grapple with global warming and climate change is due to the church too often peddling a gospel of cheap grace that expects too little in terms of Christian discipleship in an era of rapid global climate change. Regardless, Bonhoeffer insists Christian communities have an obligation to tend to the victims of injustice whose wounds are inflicted by a state's actions or inactions. A quick check of the ELCA's website for disaster response reveals a long list of places within the United States and around the world where the ELCA is reaching out via its congregations, social ministry organizations, Lutheran World Relief, and ecumenical partners to bind up the wounds of those harmed by natural disasters. The majority of these locations are places where people have been the victims of severe droughts, huge floods, and devastating tornadoes. Meteorologists and climate scientists emphasize that extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and more violent as global warming increases. Are we ready as a church to provide the increasingly large financial resources that are needed as the consequences of climate change become more severe? Will we be tempted to focus our aid only on our Lutheran brothers and sisters or only on Americans? Or will we maintain, in Bonhoeffer's words, quote, our unconditional obligation toward the victims of any societal order, even if they do not belong to the Christian community, end quote. This brings me to the third and most radical action Bonhoeffer said the church could take in relation to the state. If the church's questioning of the state falls on deaf ears, and if the victims of the state's actions or inactions continue to increase, then Bonhoeffer said the church should seize the wheel of the state itself to prevent further injustice. It's no wonder some of those present left the room at this point. Such an action would be extreme in any age. Perhaps we should just dismiss Bonhoeffer on this point because his context was so different from our own. After all, in a few short months, he had witnessed the loss of constitutional rights and the rise of the Hitler dictatorship. Our context is different. For now, at least, we live in a democratic society. Our constitutional rights are still intact. The state is not muzzling the churches. All of us have the franchise and could vote in the various elections held across the country this very day. That said, the US Congress has still not passed legislation designed to reduce the nation's greenhouse gas emissions at the rate needed to avoid catastrophic climate change. In the meantime, horizontal drilling technology and hydraulic fracturing have produced a boom in US oil and natural gas production. When combined with the ocean of oil trapped in Canadian tar sands, these new fossil fuel resources have led to America's resurgence as the largest producer of fossil fuels. The problem, of course, is that the combustion of these fossil fuels releases even more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Scientists around the world are telling us we cannot continue business as usual. There is near universal consensus that we need to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 in order to avoid catastrophic climate change. On the basis of these scientific findings and claims, many have engaged in peaceful protest marches, and some have resorted to civil disobedience to stop further emissions. Here, the focus is not on toppling the state, but rather on disrupting our political and economic reliance on fossil fuels so as to create awareness and build political will to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I want to share some examples of civil disobedience that I've used in my environmental ethics class at Luther College. The following typology is drawn from a book I have used in that course, and which is co-authored by PLU's very own Kevin O'Brien. The first form of civil disobedience I'd like to lift up is nonviolent political disruption. Take, for example, Tim DeChristopher, who disrupted a Bureau of Land Management oil and gas auction in December of 2008 by posing as bidder 70 and then outbidding oil companies for parcels around the Arches and Canyonlands national parks in Utah. DeChristopher was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison for his act of civil disobedience. His imprisonment, however, earned him an international media presence as an activist and political prisoner of the United States government. He has used this as a platform to spread the urgency of the climate crisis and the need for bold confrontational action in order to create a more just and healthy world. The second type of civil disobedience I'd like to highlight involves nonviolent economic disruption. Here's an example. Earlier this year, 160 people were arrested in northern Minnesota when they blocked the pathway of a construction site for the Line 3 oil pipeline. Some sat down in the path of heavy equipment and others chained themselves to machinery. The direct action was part of an indigenous-led multi-day event called the Treaty People Gathering, which was designed to draw attention to the fight against the pipeline that they argued will exacerbate climate change and threaten the waters of treaty lands in northern Minnesota. Their primary goal was to force the Biden administration to stop the Line 3 project as it has the Keystone XL pipeline. The last type of civil disobedience I'll lift up involves economic disruption via sabotage. A recent example can be found in my home state of Iowa, where 2 members of the Catholic Worker House in Des Moines, Jessica Resnick and Ruby Montoya, vandalized the Bakken oil pipeline on several occasions while it was under construction by damaging valves and setting fire to equipment. Ruby Montoya offered the following rationale for their actions. After having explored and exhausted all avenues of process, including attending public commentary hearings, gathering signatures for valid requests for environmental impact statements, participating in civil disobedience, hunger strikes, marches and rallies, boycotts and encampments, we saw the clear deficiencies of our government to hear the people's demands. Both women were indicted on 9 federal charges. Earlier this year, Jessica Resnick was found guilty. She was sentenced to 8 years in prison in order to provide $3.2 million in restitution. Ruby Montoya has not yet been sentenced and has made a motion to withdraw her guilty plea. The last time many Lutherans in the United States participated in organized civil disobedience was during the Civil Rights era. Have we arrived at a similar time when civil disobedience should be practiced to protest the state's inaction regarding the impact of climate change on the poor and vulnerable in both present and future generations? Might it be better to try as hard as we can to get our own house in order by reducing greenhouse gas emissions within the ELCA and within our own households? Yes, we should do that. Personal responsibility and public witness are vital. Might it be better to focus on less controversial and more constructive approaches to changing public policy? Probably, but isn't that what we have been doing? Are things changing for the better? To borrow a phrase from Martin Luther King Jr., climate scientists are urging us to face, quote, the fierce urgency of now. In earlier years, I tended to view civil disobedience with regard to climate change as self-righteous. But I find myself thinking increasingly that it is justified. At what point does one draw the line and say that things must stop? At what point does one look up and say, I can go this far, but no farther? Bonhoeffer asked himself these kinds of questions from 1933 through his death in 1945. At first, he focused on the imposition of the Aryan clause upon the life of the church. Along with other leaders of the confessing church movement who issued the Barmen Declaration in 1934, Bonhoeffer believed anti-Semitism within the church violated the integrity of the gospel and thus required a stand of confession. Later, he joined a conspiracy that worked first to arrest Hitler and then ultimately tried to assassinate Hitler 3 times. His goal was to restore the rule of law, to secure human rights, and to bring peace to a war-torn world. He gave his life for present and future generations who were the victims of some of the worst injustice our world has ever seen. The Nazi era is a stark blight on the past, but the virulence of the climate change we face now and in the near future may well match or exceed it in terms of horror and destructiveness. How will we, as Christian disciples, respond to the most pressing issue of our day? How will the church respond to the climate question? There were 2 questions that drove Bonhoeffer's theological and ethical reflection. Who is Jesus Christ for us today? And what is the responsibility of Christians in the modern world? I find it very interesting that Bonhoeffer said the following to his eldest brother in a letter in January 1934. Quote, I am becoming more convinced every day that in the West, Christianity is approaching its end, at least in its present form and its present interpretation, end quote. This is one reason why Bonhoeffer was attracted to Mohandas Gandhi. Bonhoeffer thought this Hindu took Jesus more seriously than most Christians. He wanted to visit Gandhi and learn more about his nonviolent resistance movement because, in my view, he thought Gandhi and his movement for creative nonviolent social change may be the form Christ was taking in the world in his day. Later in his book, Ethics, Bonhoeffer asserts that values like, quote, reason, justice, culture, and humanity, end quote, all spring forth from Christ, who is their origin and the center of all reality. As the confessing church gradually receded in significance, Bonhoeffer found himself working with many people who had not darkened the door of a church in a very long while, if ever. But they shared these values. What united them was their common desire for a state that preserved justice through the rule of law and the protection of human rights. Bonhoeffer believed Christ blessed those who suffered for these values because they suffered for a just cause. I find these views of Bonhoeffer to be inspiring and hopeful because they remind me that God is at work in the world outside the church. God is at work in the world among all who strive on a daily basis to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and seek to help those who are harmed by climate change. God is at work among all those people and organizations who are concerned about the welfare of present and future generations imperiled by climate change. God is at work in the world among all who are calling for climate justice and engaging in creative, nonviolent forms of civil disobedience. I think Christ is taking form in the world today in all of these ways and in many others. Well, thank you. I appreciate, again, this opportunity to deliver this lecture, and I'll turn it over to Seth and Eric to field questions as best as I'm able.
Hello, my name is Professor Seth Dowland in the Religion Department, and I've been keeping an eye on the Q&A. Again, there's a button if you would like to ask Professor Martin-Schramm a question. Feel free to submit it using the Q&A. We've got a running document featuring many of the questions, and I'll just dive right in, and feel free to add questions to the list. We'll get to as many as we can in the time we have. The first question actually comes from my colleague Samuel Torvin. He says, thank you so much for recognizing the work of Lauren Anderson as one of the first signatories, and PLU with him, of the Tawar Declaration on Environmental Sustainability. It's a commitment that has been overshadowed, if not forgotten, in recent years, and now clearly needs our wholehearted research, teaching, and advocacy. What advice do you have for restoring such commitments on our campus?
First of all, you need, I think, big goals, big aspirational goals get you further than small, measured, careful targets. So shoot big. And then the second thing I would say, and I forget where I heard this, I think it was from a government official who basically said, we need leadership. We need it from the top down, from the bottom up, from the inside out, and from the outside in. PLU undoubtedly has many excellent leaders among its students, faculty, and staff. The college will succeed where it cultivates that kind of leadership.
Thanks for that. And I'm going to apologize. I don't have names on all the questions, but I'm just going to keep rolling through them as they come up. So in addition to confronting the state's failures to address climate change, how would you apply Bonhoeffer's model to confronting non-state actors, multinational corporations, social media companies, Bitcoin miners, media conglomerates, both for direct contributions to climate change and for efforts to forestall government action? And that's a question from Eric Running.
That's a great question, Eric. Eric and I went to PLU together around the same time. So, and I think he spent most of his career in the State Department, if it's the same Eric Running. So hi, Eric. We haven't talked in decades, but what a great question. Yeah, I was sort of trapped a little bit by the framework, right, of Bonhoeffer's essay, and you're absolutely right that there are these other non-state actors that need to be held accountable as well. Certainly one of the ways that many colleges and universities, as well as other institutions, are doing that is through divestment campaigns. I think the key with divestment is to, if you're going to divest from fossil fuels, to be sure you're reinvesting in things that are less ecologically harmful. But certainly holding oil companies, fossil fuel companies, holding their feet to the fire and holding them accountable for greenwashing or for lying to their customers about the impacts of the combustion of fossil fuel on the atmosphere, I think that definitely is vital. It's challenging. Climate change, I think anti-Semitism and climate change are similar as well. I mean, we're all complicit. I have a car in the garage. We have one car. It's a Honda Clarity plug-in hybrid electric. But, I just drove out to Leavenworth in Washington, and while I used all electricity when we were there in Leavenworth and Chelan, I used gasoline to get from here to there. So yes, I want to hold accountable fossil fuel companies that have lied to us and helped to pay for sowing lots of unrest or a lack of clarity about climate change. but I have to also confess that I'm complicit in continuing to utilize their services. And to some extent, we're all trapped in that regard. And some of us have more financial resources to deal with that than others. But Eric does well to remind us that it isn't just state actions, it's also non-state actors. Great question, Eric. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is from George Unruh, and he asks, can we speak of a world of abundance in these environmental situations? And then the second question, do we not need to reduce our consumption habits to combat climate change?
Sure. Yeah. I forget where I heard this, but it's always stuck with me. Hope is a renewable resource. There's so much that is bleak in terms of the data we face. And right now, if you're paying attention to the meeting in Glasgow, the kind of dire warnings from NGOs, from climate scientists, and even from various nations, it is hard not to be frightened and to cling then to what we have and to not want to share. But I love this idea that hope is a renewable resource and that we never, that we shouldn't be running out of it. Now, having said that, the questioner is definitely right that we do need to be better stewards of these precious energy resources that we have. In general, Americans utilize we use twice as much energy on a per capita basis as people in the European Union. And yet, those of you who had the opportunity to travel to the European Union would, I think, probably agree with me that the lifestyle that many lead there is as good or better than the lifestyles we lead here. And yet they manage to do so using half the amount of energy that we do. Certainly, just speaking from our experience at Luther College, the lion's share of the emission reductions we have achieved is simply through investing in smarter, energy efficient technologies that have the dual benefit, not only of triple benefit of reducing costs, reducing emissions, and then paying a dividend going forward. We're kind of as dumb as we want to be as a society. There is just so much opportunity out there to be more efficient in our use of resources. And then, choosing to walk instead of driving, using your bike instead of driving, carpooling instead of driving your own car. There's so many ways we can reduce our consumption of these fossil fuels.
The next question is from Edith Jacobson, and it's a pointed one, so you can take it wherever you want.
If it's the Edith Jacobson I know, I would expect nothing less.
What type of civil disobedience are you willing to engage in?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's why I said I find myself thinking that it is more and more justified. But again, not because I think that the act of a solitary act of civil disobedience will make a change, but rather that act might help to create greater public awareness and shift political weight to support the changes that are necessary. So it isn't necessarily dramatic things, it can be simple things. I don't know. I have been to protests. I've had bottles thrown at me when I was a PLU student or just a recent grad, and went to Hanford, Washington, where the tritium triggers were being made for the Trident nuclear intercontinental ballistic missiles. I think another form of civil disobedience is, to tie this back to your previous questioner, sort of committing to a radical reduction in the use of resources. trying to live simply so that others may simply live. So I confess that I'm not one of those people that was strapped to a bulldozer on line 3. But what has changed for me is that I no longer view those people as being sort of self-righteous, but I'm starting to really get it, that from their perspective, this is necessary. And the last thing I'll say there, and I would welcome Edie and Steve, her husband's counsel on this. And I tried to get at this in my last bit of remarks. Gandhi was a champion of creative nonviolent resistance. I'm not the most creative guy in the world. I could really benefit from being in a group of people that thought long and hard about what civil disobedience should look like at this point in the 21st century. So I'm not ashamed to say that I don't have the right answers or all the answers in that regard. And I'd love to sit down with Edie and figure out how we can do something together.
Thanks. This is going to be our final question. I really appreciate all of you who've chimed in, and I think we've addressed certain issues that have come up in some of the other questions. This last question is again kind of returning to our current context here in the university, and it's from my colleague Kevin O'Brien, who you mentioned in your lecture. And he says, "Thanks for the great lecture. Some of Bonhoeffer's work during the Third Reich was educational. Part of his resistance was to train the next generation for the church. What do you think is the essential work of educational institutions in the age of climate change? Are there particular things we can learn about pedagogy in a time of crisis from Bonhoeffer?"
Okay, that's a good. I mean, he's alluding to the fact that Bonhoeffer was asked by the Confessing Church to direct one of its 5 seminaries. Now, I'm not saying that the schools like PLU or Luther College should suddenly only be seminaries training people to be pastors. That's not what I'm saying. But Bonhoeffer really thought that it was necessary to bring a group of, at that point, young men together to live in community and to, I think Bonhoeffer was trying to mold, it was about spiritual formation. Now, again, I know that kind of rhetoric just freaks people out. But I do think that colleges and universities, church-related colleges and universities, ELCA colleges and universities would serve our students well if we introduced them to communities of people who harbored similar concerns, passions, and commitments. Life is long. These struggles are not, this is not a challenge. This is, as Kevin says in his book, climate change is a wicked problem. It's not simple, and it's not going to be solved in our lifetimes. The emissions that we put in the atmosphere while Karen and I were driving out west will be in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, long after we return to Decorah. So I do think pedagogically, right, it's not really so much pedagogically as I think it is communally, the importance of our colleges and universities to help our young men and women find community with each other, to draw inspiration from each other, to work together on common goals and tasks to help our institutions become better stewards of energy resources and food resources. And for the faculty and staff to just as Bonhoeffer went into the kitchen and washed the dishes for the seminarians, it's important for faculty and staff to model this kind of behavior for our students. You know, what exactly does that look like? I'm not sure, but those are some initial thoughts to respond to Kevin's question. So anyway, I appreciate very much this opportunity to give the 16th annual David and Marilyn Knutson lecture. I'm really humbled. It's a serious honor and privilege. Apparently, I was less effective than Dietrich Bonhoeffer because by the time he was done, a lot of the people had left. But at least at this point, at last time I looked, there were still 197 of you. So apparently I wasn't that offensive. My email was up. Well, I don't know if it was up there. But you can find me. Just Google Jim Martin-Schramm, Luther College. If you have questions, you want to interact with me directly, by all means, please do so. Thanks again.
Thank you, everyone. I'm sorry that we don't have time to get through all of the questions in the Q&A, but we are very grateful for your attention and your interest. Thank you, Jim, for a wisdom-filled lecture. You've given us all a lot, not only to think about, but steps forward together. And so we thank you all for joining us this evening. And we hope that you will join us again for future lectures in the David and Marilyn Knutson lecture series. Have a good night, everyone.